$5 million. That was the price of my soul. That was how much it cost for Evan Cross to meet my eyes without a shred of remorse, raise his hand, and sell his only daughter in a room filled with monsters. The judgment hall didn't cheer, it held its breath. I stood inside the gilded cage, the lace of my wedding gown scratching against iron bars, realizing I wasn't a bride, I was an offering in a transaction I never saw coming. I stared through the bars, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, expecting to see a buyer looking for a toy. Instead, I found something far more terrifying. Park Do-Hyun's eyes locked onto mine like a predator that had already won, dark and unreadable and absolutely certain. He stood tall in a black suit that fit like armor, the tattoos on his neck marking him as a man who lived by a different set of laws, the kind written in blood. He didn't look at me with lust or even curiosity. He looked at me with the cold, strategic focus of a man capturing a vital piece on a chessboard. As the cage door creaked open, his hand didn't move fast, but it was deliberate, wrapping around my wrist as I was dragged to his feet. It wasn't to hurt me, it was to anchor me. To claim me. "You think this is about a debt, Amara Brooks?" he whispered, his voice low and even, like he was noting the weather while my world collapsed. "Before I take you back to the moment everything truly broke, I need to stop you here for just a breath. If you're listening to this right now, wherever you are, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this voice travels, how many strangers are standing still with me in this moment. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about survival, about lies that wear familiar faces, about the kind of courage no one warned you you'll need, then like this and subscribe. It helps this story reach the people who need to hear it. Because what I'm about to tell you didn't begin in a gilded hall, or behind iron bars, or with a man powerful enough to buy a human life. It began in a place I believed was safe. It began with trust one never questioned. With a smile I had seen my entire life. This isn't just a story about money or power. It's a story about betrayal that doesn't come with fangs, only open arms. About evil that doesn't shout, but reassures. About how the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who tuck you in at night and tell you they love you. I never imagined something like this could happen to me. Not under my own roof. Not at the hands of someone who shared my blood. But it did. And this? This is where it all really started. I swallowed, my throat so tight I could barely breathe. "My father, he said you were a monster." "Just," he repeated, his thumb brushing the pulse point on my wrist as if testing the weight of my fear. Then his eyes lowered to mine, measuring my shock. "Your father didn't sell you to pay a debt. He sold you to bury a secret." The hall remained silent, the wealthy witnesses watching our exchange as if it were mere entertainment, but in our small pocket of space, the air felt thick with the sudden scent of ozone and expensive cologne. He finally released my wrist, but I still felt caged by his presence alone, a presence that swallowed the very light of the chandeliers above us. I looked back at my father, who was already walking away, but Do-Hyun's gaze never left me. I realized then that I hadn't just been sold to a monster, I had been handed the only person who knew exactly what kind of monster my father truly was. The drive from the judgment hall to the Do-Hyun estate was a blurred descent into a nightmare I couldn't wake from, the tires of the black sedan whispering against the pavement like the secrets my father had traded for $5 million. I sat in the back seat, the voluminous lace of my wedding gown feeling like a shroud, my hand still trembling with the phantom touch of the iron bars. Beside me, Park Do-Hyun remained a silent, immovable pillar of tailored black wool and lethal intent, his gaze fixed on the city passing by as if he already owned every shadow it cast. When the car finally hummed to a halt, I was met not with a dungeon, but with a sprawling, high-society fortress that breathed old money and new violence. The estate was a labyrinth of marble and glass, but as Do-Hyun led me through the grand entrance, I felt more trapped than I ever had in the cage. He didn't speak until we reached the center of his private study, a room filled with the scent of cedar, smoke, and the heavy weight of absolute authority. I stood near the door, my posture a fragile line of restrained disbelief, waiting for the monster to finally show his teeth. "Why?" I whispered, my voice cracking through the silence. "My father said his debt was settled. He said you were the end of his problems." Do-Hyun turned, the intricate tattoos crawling up his neck catching the dim light of the chandelier as he moved with a confident, predatory grace. He didn't approach me with cruelty. Instead, he walked to a heavy mahogany desk and tossed a manila folder onto the surface. Evan Cross is a talented liar, Amara. He didn't bring you to that auction to save his skin from a debt. I moved toward the desk, my lace trailing on the polished floor like a wounded bird. My hands shook as I opened the file, but the words on the page stopped my heart. They weren't invoices or debt ledgers. They were partnership agreements, distribution logs, and wire transfers dating back years. He didn't owe me a cent, Do-Hyun said, his voice dropping to a dark, unreadable calm. We were partners. But your father got ambitious. He started running his own inventory through my ports without a cut, using my name as a shield while he built a multi-million-dollar trafficking ring in the shadows. I looked at the signatures, my father's bold, familiar script alongside Do-Hyun's sharp marks. The first terrifying secret of my new life was laid bare. I wasn't an offering to settle a debt. I was a pawn in a game between two monsters, and the man who raised me was the one who had truly built the cage. Do-Hyun stepped closer, his presence swallowing the light in the room until I felt small beneath his gaze. He didn't sell you to me because he was desperate, Amara. He sold you because you were the only person close enough to find the evidence that would hang him. He didn't give me a bride, he gave me his greatest liability to dispose of. The heavy silence of the study pressed against my eardrums as the weight of my father's betrayal settled in my bones like lead. I stood in the center of the room, my white wedding gown a jarring, ghostly stain against the dark mahogany, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Park Do-Hyun to demand the services a $5 million purchase usually entailed. My hands gripped the fabric of my dress, my knuckles white, as I prepared for the monster to finally claim what he had bought. But Do-Hyun didn't move toward me with the hunger I expected. Instead, he walked back to the tall windows, his solid, immovable frame backlit by the cold city lights that shimmered beyond the glass. He looked at the reflection of the room, and at me, the captive bride standing in the wreckage of her life, with a gaze that was detached, almost clinical. Take off that dress, Amara, he said, his voice carrying the same dark calm that had chilled me in the judgment hall. It's a costume for a play that ended the moment you walked through my doors. I flinched, my mind racing through every terrifying possibility. And replace it with what? I whispered, my voice thick with restrained disbelief. He turned then, his sharp jawline set in a hard, uncompromising line. He gestured to a smaller room connected to the study, a space filled with the hum of high-end servers and a single, sleek black desk. On the desk sat a high-resolution laptop, its screen glowing with a series of encrypted login windows. Replace it with a weapon, Do-Hyun replied, his eyes tracking over my face as if measuring my capacity for the war he was fighting. Your father thinks you're a liability he's disposed of. I think you're the only one who can navigate the digital architecture of the silent witnesses who funded that auction. He walked to the desk and tapped the screen, the blue light reflecting in the intricate tattoos that traced the side of his neck. I didn't buy you for your body, Amara. I bought your mind. You were a top consultant for corporate crisis management before Evan Cross decided to use you as currency. Now, you're going to manage mine. The monster's mercy wasn't a soft thing, it was a cold, strategic calculation. He was giving me a desk, a laptop, and a path through the dark web of his rival's finances. Follow the money, he commanded, stepping back to give me space, his presence still swallowing the light in the room. Trace every wire transfer from the number one paddle to your father's shell companies in the Caymans. If you want to survive the monster you were born to, you'd better start learning how to hunt with the one who bought you. I sat in the chair, the heavy lace of my gown pooling on the floor as I reached for the keyboard. The first terrifying secret of my new life was that the man who had bought me was the only one offering me a way to fight back. The glow of the laptop screen felt like a cold sun against my skin as the clock on the mahogany wall ticked toward midnight, marking another hour of my life in Park Do-Hyun's high society fortress. The lace of my wedding gown, now discarded in a heap in the corner, had been replaced by a simple black silk robe that felt like a second skin, a shadow to match the world I had been sold into. Do-Hyun had retreated into the sprawling maze of the estate, leaving me with the digital keys to his war and a silence so profound it was deafening. My hands hovered over the keyboard, but my mind was stuck on the image of my father's face at the auction, the way he had watched me in that cage with the same detachment one might show a piece of failing stock. I reached for the burner phone Do-Hyun had left on the corner of the desk, its screen dark and inviting. My fingers trembled as I punched in the private number I had known since I was a child, a number that was supposed to be a lifeline in a corporate crisis. I needed to hear his voice. I needed to believe that the partnership agreements and wire transfers Do-Hyun showed me were just another layer of the monster's manipulation. The line clicked open on the third ring. Hello? Evan Cross's voice was as smooth and confident as ever, carrying the easy authority of a man who never questioned his place in the world. Dad? I whispered, my voice thick with a mixture of terror and a desperate, lingering hope. There was a pause, a beat of silence that felt like a bridge collapsing. Amara, he said, and for a fleeting second, I looked for the warmth of the father who had taught me to shoot at 16. But the warmth wasn't there. Instead, his voice shifted into a register that was detached, almost clinical, the tone of a businessman whose greatest liability had just called to complain. You shouldn't be calling this number. It's compromised the second you touch it. You sold me, Dad, I rasped, my hands clenching the phone until the plastic groaned. You put me in a cage and let that man bid on me. Do-Hyun says you did it to bury a secret. He says you're the real monster. A low, humorless chuckle vibrated through the line, a sound that chilled me more than the monster's riddle ever could. Do-Hyun is a romantic, Amara. He thinks everything has to be a grand strategy. I just needed the noise to stop. You were getting too close to the audits, asking questions about the Caymans that didn't concern a PR consultant. Audits? My heart kicked into overdrive as the digital breadcrumbs I had been tracking on the laptop began to form a much darker narrative. You were using the Mafia's legitimate fronts to launder your own trafficking proceeds. You weren't a victim, you were their most corrupt supplier. And now you're a witness, Evan said, his voice dropping into a register of pure venom. Or you would be, if anyone believed the word of a captive bride sold to a crime lord. But don't worry about the business, Amara. I've already replaced you. I found a new consultant, someone who knows how to keep their mouths shut and their eyes on the profit margins. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized the true depth of the betrayal. He hadn't just sold me to pay a debt, he had discarded me like a broken tool and already moved on to the next one. I'm coming for you, Evan, I whispered, the ingrained desire to find goodness in my family finally shattering into a cold, sharp resolve. No, Amara, my father replied, and I could almost hear the smug smile on his face. You're already gone. The witnesses who funded that haul don't like loose ends. I've told them Do-Hyun is the one who wanted you dead. By the time they're finished with his estate, you'll be just another tragic story of a wedding that ended in blood. The line went dead, leaving me in a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the weight of my own execution sentence. I lowered the phone, my gaze moving back to the laptop where the data streams of my father's crimes continued to flicker like a promise. I looked toward the doorway where Do-Hyun stood in the shadows, his solid, immovable frame backlit by the dim light of the corridor. He had been listening, his expression calm and detached, as if he had already seen this car crash in slow motion. Now you know, he said, his voice carrying that same dark calm that had anchored me in the judgment hall. He's planning to eliminate me, I said, my voice steady for the first time since the auction. And he's going to frame you for it. Do-Hyun stepped into the room, his presence swallowing the light until the air felt thick with the scent of ozone and cedar. Then we'd better make sure you're much more than just a witness, Amara Brooks. The invitation was a heavy, cream-colored card that felt like a death warrant in my hand, its embossed gold lettering announcing the Artemis Foundation Gala, a high-profile charity event where the city's elite gathered to pretend their money wasn't soaked in blood. In the week since my father's voice had turned to ice over the phone, the Do-Hyun estate had transformed from a prison into a training ground, and now, it was time for the captive bride to walk back into the lion's den. Park Do-Hyun stood in the center of the dressing room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching with that unsettling, predatory focus as the stylists he'd summoned finished their work. I didn't wear lace tonight. Instead, I was draped in midnight blue silk that shimmered like oil on water, the fabric clinging to every curve with a slit up the thigh that felt like a dare. My natural curls were pinned back into a sharp, professional bun, exposing the hard line of my jaw, my war paint for the evening. "You look like a miracle worker," Amara, Do-Hyun said, his voice a low, dark vibration that stirred the tiny hairs at the nape of my neck. He reached out, his thumb grazing my lower lip to smear the burgundy lipstick into something more dangerous. "But remember, the men in that ballroom aren't looking for a savior. They're looking for a trophy they missed out on at the auction." "I'm not a trophy anymore," I whispered, meeting his unreadable gaze in the mirror. I reached for my clutch, feeling the weight of the compact, matte black pistol Do-Hyun had insisted I carry, handle first, just as my father had taught me a lifetime ago. We arrived at the Biltmore in a limousine with privacy glass, the world outside a blur of neon and rain. As we stepped onto the red carpet, the camera flashes were blinding, a barrage of white light that felt like an interrogation. Do-Hyun's hand settled at the small of my back, possessive and warm through the thin silk, a reminder that I was now part of the family business. The ballroom was a masterpiece of excess, crystal chandeliers the size of cars, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, and floor-to-ceiling towers of white roses that smelled of funeral arrangements. But beneath the classical music and the clink of champagne flutes, I could feel the eyes, the cold, calculating stares of the silent witnesses. "Smile," Do-Hyun murmured against my ear, his breath smelling of cedar and smoke. "You're supposed to be enjoying the spoils of your new life." I moved through the crowd on his arm, playing the role of the charmed consultant, but my mind was a scope finding its targets. I catalogued the faces, the pharmaceutical executive who'd bid $3 million, the tech CEO who'd leaned forward in his balcony seat with a leer, and the senator who'd watched the auction with a ledger in his hand. They were all here, hiding behind masks of philanthropy while funding the very cage I'd just escaped. Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Standing near the bar, nursing a drink with practiced ease, was the new consultant my father had mentioned, a woman whose eyes were as hollow as mine had been a week ago. She was surrounded by the men who had bid on me, her presence a silent confirmation that Evan Cross had already moved on to his next transaction. "Identify them, Amara," Do-Hyun commanded softly, pulling me onto the dance floor to maintain our cover. As we moved together, his hand splayed across my lower back, I felt the sharp edge of the monster's intensity. I whispered the names into his shoulder, one by one, tracing the financial network that linked my father to every powerful man in the room. We weren't just dancing, we were mapping a massacre. The Gala of Masks was a performance, but as I looked into Do-Hyun's dark eyes, I realized the biggest lie was the one I was telling myself, that I could dismantle my father's world and still walk away with my soul intact. The morning after the gala felt like an adrenaline crash, the opulent high society front of the Artemis Foundation still flickering behind my eyelids like a fever dream. I was back in Do-Hyun's private study, the air thick with the scent of cedar and the cold mechanical hum of the high-end servers that were now my only truth. I had traded the midnight blue silk for charcoal slacks and a silk blouse the color of dried blood, my natural curls tied back into a tight bun that felt like war paint. I sat at the sleek black desk, 3 monitors glowing in the dimness, my fingers flying across the keyboard with the clinical efficiency of a woman who had spent 10 years cleaning up corporate messes. Do-Hyun remained a shadow in the office, pacing at the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand, his solid frame backlit by the rising sun. He didn't hover, but I felt his predatory focus like a physical weight between my shoulder blades. I was pushing past the military-grade encryption that had once protected my father's most sensitive accounts, tracing the digital breadcrumbs that led away from the Mafia and back to the man who had raised me. "You're digging deep, Amara," Do-Hyun said, his voice a low, even vibration that made my spine straighten. "I have to," I whispered, not looking away from the cascading rows of green data. The accounts at the auction were just the surface. Someone had to coordinate the transport, the logistics, and the buyers. Someone had to be the arbiter before you even walked into the room. I initiated a system-wide financial lockout on a shell company I had found hidden in a third-tier layer of the Caymans, a ghost corporation named Crossings Incorporated. My heart kicked into overdrive as the decryption key finally clicked. I didn't find debt ledgers. I found a narrative of systematic destruction. "There," I breathed, my hands trembling slightly as I pulled up the primary communications log. I opened a series of encrypted messages between an alias, the broker, and a network of international silent witnesses. The broker wasn't a mafia lieutenant, he was the one giving them orders. I scrolled through the metadata, tracing the IP pings back to a device that had consistently been used from my childhood home on nights when my father told me he was working late at the firm. He's not just a supplier, Do-Hyun, I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, small and broken by the weight of the evidence. I pulled up a final document, a master manifest of human cargo that had been moved through the port under the guise of Do-Hyun's legitimate import-export business. Evan Cross's digital signature was at the bottom of every shipment. Do-Hyun moved closer, his presence swallowing the light until I felt caged by his proximity alone. He looked at the screen, his jaw tight, his shoulders rigid like a man who had finally seen the face of the enemy he had been hunting in the dark. He's the crown prince, I whispered, the words tasting like ash. The Mafia wasn't taking over his territory. He was using your syndicate as a delivery service for his own horrors. You were never his partner, Do-Hyun. You were his cover. I looked up at him, meeting those dark, unreadable eyes. The smoking gun was in front of us, rendered in cold pixels and high-resolution high-res greed. My father was the monster I had been told to fear, and I had just handed the monster who bought me the evidence he needed to start a war. Whatever the cost, Do-Hyun said quietly, his hand resting on the back of my chair, a promise of shared damnation that I finally understood. Now we make him bleed. The plan was born in the cold, blue light of the office, but it was executed under the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. Do-Hyun had decided that the only way to lure a predator like Evan Cross out of the shadows was to offer him exactly what he wanted, proof that his liability was no longer under the Mafia's protection. I had spent the morning preparing for the performance, choosing an outfit that looked like the wreckage of the woman I used to be, a cream suit that was now wrinkled and stained, my hair disheveled, and my makeup smeared to suggest a night of weeping. I looked like a failed investment, a trophy that had lost its luster. The Four Seasons press room was a sea of camera flashes and aggressive shouting, a Shark Tank I had once navigated with ease as a consultant, but today I was the bait. I stood on the stage, slightly behind and to the left of the podium, feeling the weight of every lens in the room as they catalogued my apparent downfall. Do-Hyun approached the microphone, his charcoal suit immaculately tailored, his expression a mask of cold, corporate indifference that made my heart ache even though I knew the script. I know there have been questions regarding my recent acquisition from the Cross estate, Do-Hyun began, his voice steady and authoritative, cutting through the chaos like a blade. He didn't look at me, and that was the hardest part of the lie, the sudden, absolute distance he projected. I am here to announce that I am terminating my association with Amara Brooks, effective immediately. The room erupted, the noise hitting me like a physical blow as journalists fought to be the first to capture my humiliation. Do-Hyun leaned into the microphone, his eyes flat and depthless as he delivered the killing blow to my reputation. We discovered that Miss Brooks used her position to systematically embezzle funds from my organization. She is nothing but a common thief who thought she could sleep her way to the top. The words were poison, designed to make me untouchable by anyone in the legitimate world and a target for anyone in the dark one. Security guards, men I had shared coffee with just yesterday, grabbed my arms with a roughness that wasn't entirely staged. They dragged me from the stage, past the loading dock, and dumped me on the rain-slicked sidewalk like trash. The side exit slammed shut with a decisive, metallic click that sounded like a prison cell locking. I stood alone in the downpour, the cream suit soaking through in seconds as the rain washed away my war paint. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from an unknown number that I knew was Do-Hyun's silent team. Get somewhere safe now. He's watching. The humiliation burned in my veins, a salt and battery feeling that made the tears mixing with the rain taste like genuine betrayal. It was a performance, a strategic discard to convince my father that I was broken and vulnerable, but as I walked toward the coffee shop in the back corner of the district, I realized the cost of the sacrifice. To save my life, Do-Hyun had to destroy the woman he had just begun to respect, leaving me exposed in the middle of a war where my father was the only one left to rescue me. The warehouse district loomed ahead, a graveyard of rusted metal and broken windows that felt like the perfect setting for an execution. I walked toward it with my chin up and my hands empty, playing the role of the broken, discarded woman seeking rescue from the only man left who shared her blood. The rain had stopped, but my cream suit was still damp and heavy, clinging to me like the shame Do-Hyun had manufactured at the press conference. Beneath the ruined silk of my jacket, the wire Do-Hyun's team had fitted was a cold, thin line against my skin, and the small pistol strapped to my inner thigh was the only thing keeping my heart from failing. Evan Cross was waiting inside the cavernous, hollowed-out space, leaning against a rusted desk with the same smug confidence that had defined my childhood. He looked at me not as a father looks at a daughter he's saved, but as a predator looks at a trapped animal that has finally stopped running. "Mel," he said, using the nickname I had once loved, his voice warm with a paternal concern that I now recognized as poison. "I saw the news. I told you Do-Hyun was a monster. I'm glad you finally realized you belong back with your own." "Cut the act, Evan," I spat, my voice sharp enough to draw blood as I stayed just out of his reach. "You didn't bring me here for a family reunion. You want the encryption keys to the Sinaloa accounts." His expression shifted instantly, the warmth bleeding out to reveal the cold, calculating broker underneath. "Always too smart for your own good," he murmured, circling me slowly. "The Mafia is finished, Amara. Do-Hyun has already discarded you. Give me the keys, and I'll give you the freedom he never could, a new life, a new name, and enough money to forget you were ever in that cage." "And what about the people you sold?" I challenged, my mind focusing on the wire that was recording every syllable. "What about the human cargo on those manifests I found in Do-Hyun's safe? You weren't just a partner to the Mafia, you were the one giving them orders." Evan laughed, a hollow sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "I'm a businessman, Amara. The Mafia provided the muscle and the ports, I provided the infrastructure and the high society buyers who were too refined to deal with street thugs. You were supposed to be my legacy, but you got too curious about the silent witnesses. You were using Do-Hyun as a scapegoat for your massacres," I whispered, stepping closer to ensure the mic caught the depth of his confession. "He was the perfect shield," Evan admitted, his eyes gleaming with the triumph of a man who believed he had already won. "Everyone expects a Mafia boss to be a monster. No one expects the respected PR consultant. I've been running this city's darkest secrets for a decade, and I'll be running them long after Do-Hyun is dead." He pulled his standard-issue weapon and pressed the cold barrel against my temple, his finger relaxing slightly on the trigger as he reached for the phone in my hand. "Last chance, Amara. The keys, or I paint these walls with your brain matter." I didn't flinch. I looked into his eyes and smiled, a predatory expression that matched the one Do-Hyun had worn the night he bought me. "I lied about the keys, Evan. And I'm not the only one who's been listening." The warehouse lights flickered and died, and in the 3 seconds of darkness that followed, I realized the monster who bought me was the only one who had ever truly intended to set me free. The scent of salt and diesel hung heavy over Port 42, a sprawling iron graveyard where the fog rolled off the black water to swallow the shipping containers whole. This was the heart of the empire my father had built on the backs of the broken, the place where his manifests became reality. I stood in the shadow of a rusted crane, the weight of the matte black pistol in my hand no longer a burden, but a natural extension of my resolve. The wire was dead, the confession was recorded, and now the only thing left was the blood. A sudden flash of muzzle fire ripped through the mist near the pier, the sharp crack of suppressed weapons signaling that Do-Hyun's team had engaged the perimeter. I moved with a clinical, predatory grace I hadn't known I possessed, slipping through the labyrinth of steel crates as the port erupted into a chaotic symphony of violence. I wasn't the girl in the gilded cage anymore, I was the hunter. In the center of the loading zone, I saw him. Park Do-Hyun was a silhouette of lethal precision, his charcoal suit jacket discarded, his white shirt stained with soot and spray. He was pinned behind a stack of pallets, his weapon barking as he held off a trio of my father's high society enforcers. From the elevated gantry above, I caught the glint of a scope. My father, Evan Cross, was leaning over the railing, his face twisted into a mask of desperate greed as he lined up a shot on Do-Hyun's exposed shoulder. "Do-Hyun!" I screamed, but my voice was lost to the roar of a nearby generator. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I raised my weapon, my father's own lessons echoing in my mind, breathe out, find the center, pull, don't jerk star. The recoil jarred my arm as I fired. The bullet sparked off the metal railing inches from Evan's head, forcing him to dive for cover. The distraction was enough. Do-Hyun pivoted, dropping two of the enforcers with surgical rounds before diving toward a shipping container for better cover. But my father was fast. He rolled, leveled his rifle, and fired a blind shot that caught Do-Hyun in the side. I watched the man who had bought my freedom stumble, his blood a dark, shocking crimson against the gray concrete. The world narrowed to a single point of focus. I climbed the ladder to the gantry, my breath hitching as I reached the top. Evan was reloading, his hands shaking, the first sign of weakness I had ever seen in the man I once called a hero. He looked up, his eyes widening as he saw me standing there, the captive bride draped in the wreckage of a cream suit, holding death in her hands. "Amara, wait," he gasped, his paternal mask slipping back into place, a pathetic attempt to manipulate a daughter who no longer existed. "Think about the legacy. We can still walk away with the money. Do-Hyun is a criminal, a monster. He's the man who showed me who you really are," I said, my voice as cold as the harbor water. Evan lunged for his rifle, but I was faster. I fired twice. The first round caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, the second found its mark in his chest. He staggered back, the look of stunned betrayal on his face almost comical before he tumbled over the railing and disappeared into the churning black wake of the port. I didn't watch him fall. I scrambled down the ladder, my boots skidding on the wet ground until I reached Do-Hyun. He was leaning against the cold steel of a container, his hand pressed firmly against the wound in his side. He looked up at me, his dark eyes unreadable, but for the first time, I saw something that looked like pride. "You saved me," he rasped, his voice a low vibration that made the air feel thick. "I ended it," I replied, kneeling beside him and tearing a strip of silk from my ruined jacket to bind the wound. "The broker is gone. The manifests are ours." He reached out, his blood-stained hand cupping my jaw with a possessive, grounding pressure that signaled the end of my captivity and the beginning of our reign. The sirens were screaming in the distance, but as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, I realized the only monster left was the one I had chosen to rule beside. The heavy silence of the judgment hall was no longer suffocating, it was hollow, a tomb for the secrets we had finally dragged into the light. 6 months had passed since the fog at Port 42 had swallowed my father's legacy, yet the scent of cold stone and old wax in this room still tasted of my own fear. I stood in the center of the floor, my heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic cadence against the marble that once felt like a stage for my execution. I wasn't wearing white lace or midnight silk today. I wore a tailored black suit that matched the shadow cast by the man standing beside me, my natural curls pinned back with a precision that signaled the end of my mourning and the beginning of my rule. Park Do-Hyun remained the immovable pillar I had first seen from behind bars, his presence still swallowing the light, but the distance between us had vanished. He stood close enough that I could feel the steady warmth of his frame, his jaw set in a hard line of satisfaction as he surveyed the empty balconies where the silent witnesses had once sat. The pharmaceutical executives, the senators, and the tech giants were gone, some in cells, others in graves, all of them dismantled by the digital evidence we had harvested together. In the center of the hall stood the gilded cage. It looked smaller than I remembered, its ornate iron bars reflecting the flickering light of the chandeliers above. It was a relic of a world that treated people as inventory, a monument to the man who had sold his own blood for a seat at the table. "It's empty," Do-Hyun said, his voice a low, dark vibration that resonated in the hollow space. He looked at me, his unreadable eyes tracing the line of my jaw with a possessive, grounding focus. "The auctions end today, Amara. The broker's network has been redirected. Every port, every shell company, every legitimate front is now under your name." I walked toward the cage, my hand reaching out to touch the cold metal. I didn't flinch. I felt the strength of the woman who had pulled the trigger on a gantry, the woman who had realized that to survive a monster, you didn't have to be a victim, you had to become a partner. "We aren't just taking over, are we?" I whispered, my gaze meeting his. "We are rebuilding," Do-Hyun replied, stepping forward to stand behind me. His hand settled at the small of my back, a familiar anchor that no longer felt like a claim, but a commitment. K-Town belongs to a different kind of monster now. One that protects its own. He handed me a heavy, industrial-grade bolt cutter, the steel cold and purposeful in my grip. I didn't hesitate. With a single, sharp movement, I snapped the lock that had held me, the metallic crack echoing through the hall like a gunshot. Then, together, we pushed. The cage groaned, its gilded frame buckling as we dismantled the bars piece by piece, leaving nothing but a pile of useless metal on the marble floor. I looked up at the empty balconies, the silent witnesses, now a memory of a dark past. I wasn't a captive bride, and I wasn't just a witness. I was the architect of a new underworld, standing beside the man who had bought my freedom by showing me my own power. "The judgment hall is closed," I said, my voice steady and certain, carrying to the furthest corners of the room. Do-Hyun reached out, his hand cupping my jaw, his thumb tracing the pulse point that had once hammered with terror. "And the queen is in her counting house," he murmured, a rare, lethal smile ghosting his lips. We walked out of the hall together, leaving the wreckage of the cage behind us. The sun was rising over the city, a harsh, bright dawn that revealed a world where the monsters no longer hid in the shadows, they simply ruled them.